I do want to we've been chatting away here for half an hour now, but I would hope that some of our audience have got a few questions based on what we've just been discussing. What we'll do, so we can make sure it's captured for the recording, if you do have any questions, I'll repeat them so we can make sure the sound's captured correctly. Do we have any questions from the audience? Have we stunned you with this flood of information? So did you see a higher level of capability by those regulated organisations? I guess not just financial services, but other industries that are regulated?
No.
Well, did that surprise you then, to not see that? You would expect...
I'd actually say what you got was a narrower concept.
Okay.
So you were if we took financial services as an example, you would get very much the risk management focused version of resilience. You're not going to get, there's no shaping there.
And is that because there's an external party telling them that this is what the view of resilience should be?
That's one factor. Market dynamics are different. In Australia we have big four banks. So it's not nearly as cutthroat in a sense, and that changes your the way in which you think about competition and the markets that you have to be in and all of those sorts of things. So there's nothing to go out and recreate, to reinvent. And so that whole concept then drives and filters down.
So the need for shaping is less strong. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? So we're looking at bringing resilience aspects into our exercise planning.
Okay. It's probably general principles around the main one, actually, which some of the CEOs spoke about quite explicitly, is it has to be authentic. So you can't have some sort of Mickey Mouse exercise to go through the motions, because all that breeds is cynicism, and cynicism is the opposite of resilience, because that's the opposite of trust, right? If you start to get cynical about the exercise, then suddenly you're into well, I'm not really engaged and committed to this anymore, and being engaged and committed is a critical driver of trust. So that's sort of what we found interesting about a lot of those cultural characteristics, in that the way in which they get assembled, there would appear to be some sort of an order to that. So, the way in which you communicate, the CEO communicates, the leadership team communicates, is important. It has to be open, it has to be honest, it has to be seen as authentic. Otherwise you just get a cynical sort of view of the world. Now, if you're undertaking your exercise in a cultural context which is born of cynicism and all of those sorts of things, then it's probably going to be seen as a cynical exercise even before you begin. So that's why the authenticity is very important. I would probably add in diversity to that. So who's taking part in the exercise? Are they meeting people in the organisation that they haven't met before? Are they being forced to work with them under pressure in a way that they haven't been forced to work before? Because you're building new bonds, you're creating trust.
It's a very good question, because I recall, because it is one of the ways that we as practitioners would have the best chance to engage with CEOs in this area and sort of score meaningful points, if you like. You had a quote, I recall earlier, that talked about exercising and doing it in a way that was meaningful. I think was caused some stress or caused challenge. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it does the exercise force people together to build relationships? Not necessarily stress, but it's about being seen as being real.
But also challenging, difficult. I recall it was say they didn't want the test to be easy. It wasn't conditioned to be success.
That's right. It has to put the organisation under stress.
Yes.
As not necessarily quite so much the person, but certainly the organisation. So you can't. I think the critical thing is don't do Mickey Mouse exercises. They have to be pretty full on, as real as possible, and engage as many people in them as you can, that then start to see the legitimacy of it. Because they will learn things about the organisation that they didn't know.
So observations on the utility sector.
So a number of CEOs in those sectors talked about the fact that they were sort of, well, the organisation was constantly being stressed. So there's scales of stress, I guess, and they were saying, look, we sort of think that actually that stress is pretty good because it keeps you on your toes. I remember one CEO said that success can potentially be bad for resilience because you start to get slack, right? So
get comfortable.
Having that continuous perturbation, that continuous testing, that continuous stressing was quite important. The utilities were all change and adapters, so there was no shapers within that sector, but there's also good reasons for that. I mean, a lot of them have their organisational purpose enshrined in an Act of Parliament or something like that, so it's not that they're going to go out and recreate themselves in some sort of new image. The other thing that probably characterised the utilities more than any of the other sectors was the level of cooperation between organisations. So the fact that you had mutual aid agreements going on and all of those sorts of things didn't really come up in the highly competitive areas as much as you would expect. So there was much more.
But they refer to that as one of the key contributors for their organisation's resilience. They would collaborate with other organisations.
And again, then trust comes in again.
Yep.
So there was a quote from one of the CEOs, you know, if so-and-so calls me at 2 o'clock in the morning, I don't have to question what they're calling me for. You know, I know how their people have been trained. I know they're not going to call me for no reason. So as soon as they call, I'm onto it.
I'll take that call.
Yeah, and again, that's about the patterns of prediction. It's about this trust business. Do I know what they're going to do?
Okay.
And how is that built up over time?
Some of the reasons for the resistance to the term of resilience, because it's seen in some ways as more of a leadership type activity, or the concepts we're talking about are leadership concepts.
I think, there's a couple of things in that. One is that I think our study results do come out as looking like a leadership study, but then again, they're all CEOs, so you would hope. But the second thing is that I think actually the issue around definition probably creates a lot of problems for people. What are you talking about? I'm not really clear what you're talking about, so I'm not going to engage in that concept. And to me, it doesn't worry me, because I sort of look at it and go, well, okay, so it's contextually specific. So if we want to talk about resilience, what's the context? Let's just be clear about the context and we can get on with it. But I don't know, I haven't really experienced the resistance, so.
I think there's a few in the room that have, but.
Oh, well, that might be around the definition. See, if your definition doesn't match, then you're not talking about what they want to talk about.
So did you find that? I mean, that the CEOs kind of were looking for legislational guidance?
So again, context is everything, right? So, and sort of my view, I guess, also gets layered over this. Some sectors, you want them to be regulated. In fact, you don't really want them to be that competitive. I don't want my hospital to be competitive. I want to go in there and be fixed if that happens. Similarly, I'm not too bothered about whether the banks are competitive, because I don't want the financial system to fall over. Other areas, competition is probably a better thing. Now, that means that has a flow on in terms of regulation and business continuity and all of those sorts of things. Most of the CEOs probably had a more organic view of it. It's sort of like, well, isn't it just a good thing to do? Isn't it in our best interest to do it anyway? So if you regulate how I have to do it, by definition, the regulation's not going to be contextually specific to my organisation's specific needs. So you're going to add overhead to the organisation that may or may not even deliver on the business continuity outcome that's relevant to me. So, no, would probably be the answer. It would be
an unusual CEO in favour of regulation or more legislation, wouldn't it? You don't come across many that go down.
Probably not, but most of them would be accepting of regulation that was. So one example: differences between the states in Australia that add no value. Why is a food label here different to a food label in Queensland? That kind of regulation doesn't add all that much value.
So did your discussions with the CEO cover technology and its impact on
Yep.
resilience?
So there's two parts to that thing. Again, context specific. So the first is that if we took telecommunications as an example, they were all talking about redundancy in the system, similar to energy actually. Energy, there's a lot of discussion of the sort of the engineered in, not engineered in terms of patterns, but engineered in terms of the physical installation of redundancy in the system and how it's designed and the architecture so that it's designed from the beginning to be resilient, right? So they were very much across that, and yeah, that's all important. The second bit around the recreating industries though, that's sort of a much broader discussion, because that's much more about, well, how does an organisation creatively destruct itself over time? Very few of them do that well. And that's, so where you get that as being interesting, I think, is you've got to layer a number of things in there. One is that you've got these short-term tenures of the CEOs. The companies that did it well had a multi-generational view of their CEO. So the board would hold the vision, the board would hold the culture and all of those sorts of things. New CEO comes in, your job is to deliver this part of the vision and take it from here to here, and 8 years later, the other person that's being bred up from beneath you will do the next step. And so they've got that much longer term vision. They've accepted that the CEO tenure is not going to be forever, and that's built into the overall structure of the way in which the organisation is governed. But it's a small number that do that.
Clearly there's a lot to this subject, more than we have time for today, and the clock is beating us again, as it always does. But I'm also aware that I'm standing between us and the next part of the evening in a room not far from here. So I'll wrap up the discussion if I can now and thank Robert, but also hand to Brian, please.